Hello there, John Williamson back here again with ISN with these videos on how to play music online in real time. Now in the section immediately before this we were setting up our internet router so that one of us, me, can act as a server. We installed Jacktrip and got it ready, and we found the terminal where you can run the Jacktrip command from. So in this section we're just going to quickly establish a simple one-to-one connection between the two of us. I will be acting as the server, so I've done the stuff on the router to set up port forwarding and so on, as we discussed in the previous section. And Sam's going to be the client, so only one of us has to go through that setup procedure. But aside from that, Sam has done everything that I've done. So he's installed Jack, he's installed QJack CTL, he's tested his internet, he has an Ethernet cable instead of Wi-Fi, etc., etc. So now I'll go into my computer desktop here. I'm going to open QJack CTL again from my application. So this is what we opened up for testing before. I'm going to click in Setup, check that interface is my audio interface. If you don't have an audio interface plugged in, you can just be using your internal mic on your laptop, and you would just choose default there, and that would be no problem. Leave it as it is. Here I'm going to choose a sample rate of 44,100 and frames per period, also known as buffer size, of 64. The higher this number is, the fewer glitches there will be, but the higher the latency will be. Okay. The lower it is, the vice versa. The latency number down here is not to do with the internet latency. This is just the internal latency, and it's very small. So just in case anybody gets distracted by that. So I would set those settings and I would write them down, because those are exactly the same settings that Sam needs to have. He must have the same sample rate and the same buffer size down here. I would click OK, and then from the controls here I would press Start, which is that button there. I've done it already, but that starts up the Jack server. The Jack server lives on my computer, and what it does is allow me to reroute audio between different programs, as you'll see demonstrated very shortly. So at the moment I have it started, that's fine, there's no errors that have popped up. And now I'm going to open the terminal, which we showed you already. I'm just going to clear some space here, pressing enter a few times. Now I'm typing Jacktrip. Remember when we did this before, we just had a load of information that doesn't mean much to us at the moment, telling us how to use Jacktrip. But now I'm going to give it some options, okay, and I'll show you what that means. I'm typing Jacktrip-S firstly. That means make a server as opposed to being a client. So I'm typing that. And then I'm typing -N1. That's going to set the number of channels to be 1. So instead of sending stereo audio over the internet, we'll just send a single channel, and we can duplicate that into both headphones. It just minimizes the data usage and will give us the best chance of having good results on our first try. So I press enter there, and some stuff happens, and now it's waiting for a connection. So Sam, if you can just unmute yourself.
Yep.
Hi Sam, this is Sam Leek, great jazz piano player, everybody. And he's going to run the same command as I just did, apart from it's going to look like this. Okay, so it still has the -N1 at the end, but where I had -S before to be a server, Sam has -C to be a client. And in here, he types the external IP address of me. So go back to the previous sections if you don't understand what that means. Sam is not going to read out my IP address because it's technically a security risk, I suppose. But he's entered that IP address there, something like 88.239.21.10 or something like that, but it's not that. And he's going to press enter on his terminal, and what do we have here? Receive connection from peer. Okay, so now Sam is connected to me via Jacktrip, and that's good. Now Sam will be doing the same thing on his end while I'm talking about this, but I'm going back into QJack CTL there, and now I'm going to click Graph. And what I see before me is a representation of the routing that Jack is doing for me. System on the left, these two captures are the two input sockets on my audio interface. If you're just using your internal laptop mic, you probably still have two here, but they will be the left and right channels of the microphone, so it doesn't really matter which one you use at this stage. The system on the right is the speakers, or in my case, it's the headphone output from my audio interface. So it makes sense because my interface has two outputs and two inputs, and I can see them both here. So these are the two sides of my headphones. This up here, don't worry about that yet. We'll deal with that in a later video, but that's just to allow me to record the real-time audio as well as the Zoom audio in order to make things simple. And then here, this is the key bit. This is Sam. Okay, so he has a send socket into which I'm sending my audio. So that means the input from my microphone in the audio interface is going into the send. It's going across the internet to Sam. On the other side, this receive is where I receive the audio from Sam. And there's a connection here going into one channel of my earphones. Okay, but what I'm going to do is drag, so just click and drag a connection from that receive into playback 2. So now when Sam plays, I'll hear him in both earphones, which is just a more pleasant experience for me. Those are the connections I need. Most of them were there by default. If you have maybe if I plugged into the other socket of my interface, I would do this, so that capture 2 goes there instead. But for any of these connections, I can always click on them and press disconnect. Okay. Again, as I said, don't worry about this extra bit up here. We'll deal with that later on. Hello, I'm back. So you've just seen me and Sam setting up our one-to-one connection via Jacktrip for real-time audio. And now I want to show you some stuff about tweaking the settings for Jacktrip in order to optimize this balance between latency and glitches. So this is a concept that I spoke about in the first video. Definitely start there if you haven't. Okay, it's very important. But assuming that you have and you've got to this at the right time, what I'll tell you about is some ways that we can either increase the latency slightly and reduce the presence of audio glitches, or if we have not many glitches or we want to really optimize latency, we can reduce the latency further and possibly introduce a few glitches by doing that. Okay. So I'm going to go into my computer again and yeah, let's just say we have Jacktrip running at the moment. Okay, so let's say I'm in the terminal here, and me and my colleague Sam, in this case, we've decided that we don't like the glitches that are there, so we're going to slightly increase our latency, but remove some of those glitches. Okay, what we would do is both of us would go into the terminal here on our computer, press Ctrl+C on the keyboard, and that will stop the Jacktrip process, as you see just there. Okay, and now we can press the up arrow on the keyboard and it will restore the previous command that was there, ready for us to add to it or to press enter. And the thing we're going to add is -Q and then 6. This is an option, which is what the minus sign means, that increases the size of the Q from 4, which is the default, up to 6. So the Q is a kind of mini buffer inside Jacktrip itself, which, just like any buffer size, has the effect of increasing latency the higher it gets, but therefore reducing glitches as well. So we would both choose the same number. I think that's the simplest way to do it. And we could choose 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 or something like that if we want to increase some latency but reduce glitches. On the other hand, we could set it to 2 if we want to really minimize latency and we don't care about introducing a few glitches. Okay, so for now, let's say 6. We go back into QJackCTL. I'm switching windows here just by pressing Command and Tab on the keyboard, which is a nice trick. And then I would go into Graph and drag the connections to the correct places, as we showed already earlier on. So that's one way of increasing latency and gaining an improvement in glitches, hopefully. Another thing we can do is, having closed Jacktrip by pressing Ctrl+C, we go back into QJackCTL and press Stop. Go into Setup, just here, and these settings here, you'll recognize them from before. So earlier on we used 44, 100 and 64, like that, and that's a good default set of options. If you increase the sample rate from this value, you theoretically will decrease the latency as well. However, once you get to larger values, you may end up putting quite a lot of stress on the processor in your computer, which will in turn potentially have negative effects on latency. So I tend to leave that about there at 44100. This one is more useful. Increasing to 128 from 64, it's going to give me a bit more latency, which still might be fine depending on the music that I'm playing, but it's going to reduce the glitches dramatically. So I would go in there, press OK, start the server up again, and Sam does the same thing on his side, and then we both go back into the terminal, press the up arrow on the keyboard to restore the previous command, and press enter. And then you would go back into the graph here, wire up the connections as before, and we would see how it sounded. So this is a pretty easy trial and error process, and it's not guessing. Okay, so it's sort of an educated variation of all these two main levers in order to try and optimize the balance of latency and glitches for your own internet conditions.